Okay. So let us begin. We are currently learning about Tchias HaMesim. We're learning the story, the process, the spirituality, the secret of resurrection of the dead. And this mimer goes through, as we've begun to learn, it goes through the process, the spiritual process of coming to understand how Tchias HaMesim works. So effectively what we have learned so far is that there are three major stages of spiritual development that happen, so to speak, in the next world. And those stages are Gan Eden. Next is Mashiach. And then we have Tchias HaMesim. So we need to understand what these three are and how they all operate. Effectively, what we have seen so far, and the reason we began this conversation is because our sages tell us, Kol Yisrael yeshnam chelek lo'olam haba, that all of Israel have a portion in the world to come. And we asked an interesting question: how could it be that all of Israel, that seems to imply it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how religious you are, it doesn't matter how spiritual you are, it doesn't matter how connected you are, that everybody has a portion in the world to come. So you got to ask yourself the question, how? How does everybody get in? What are the entry requirements? And how come it is that to enter Gan Eden, which is a spiritual experience of note, but definitely not at the same level as Olam Haba, as the world to come, and we just know that logically, because first there is Gan Eden, and you graduate to Olam Haba. So how come it is that in order to get into Gan Eden, there are all kinds of requirements, and in order to get to the world to come, there are fewer requirements? Effectively, what we've learned so far is that to enter Gan Eden, a person needs to study Torah. In order to have access to the world to come, the resurrection of the dead, one needs to do mitzvahs. The difference between Torah and mitzvahs is that there are two primary channels of divine revelation. One is called Memale Kol Olmin. That is a channel of divine revelation that relates to and connects with different things at different spiritual levels. There's another kind of divine channel which is called Soivev Kol Olmin. That's completely on Hashem's terms. It's divine revelation as Hashem chooses to share it, and it is not calibrated to suit the recipient. So learning Torah is individual. Everybody learns differently. Your brain works one way, the next person's brain works the next way, another person's brain works differently. So our experience of an access to Torah is personal and unique. Therefore, Torah gives us access to that channel of divine revelation that is personal and unique. And that's what is shared in Gan Eden. When we do mitzvahs, mitzvahs are across the board. They're equal to everybody. You put on tefillin, Moshe Rabbeinu puts on tefillin, I put on tefillin, we all get exactly the same experience. One mitzvah, one dose of divine revelation, the same degree of divine revelation regardless of who's wearing the tefillin. So that gives us access to that divine revelation, which is beyond the individual and beyond being personalized. That will be revealed at a later, because it's a higher revelation of divine energy. It's higher and therefore cannot be personalized, and therefore it will be accessed at a higher time, which means the period of Olam Haba, the world to come, the time of the resurrection. How do we get there? Through mitzvahs. Who has mitzvahs? Everybody. Not everybody has Torah learning. Everybody's got mitzvahs. Our sages tell us, Afilu Poishe Yisrael, even the so-called sinners of Israel, are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. Equal access for everybody. Then we learned that there are actually two stages within the period known as Olam Haba, the world to come. The first stage is 1 degree of divine revelation, the degree of divine revelation that is relative to the mitzvahs we have done. And then there's an even deeper experience. And that will happen when Hashem reveals his incredible nachas and pleasure that he gets just from us being us. In other words, the revelation of godliness as it connects to us because we're Jewish, not because we did mitzvahs, because we're Jewish. That's what we've begun to learn so far. Okay, So today what we're going to start to look at is, if you really want to understand this properly, we need to do a comparison between the experience of the time of Mashiach and the experience of Gan Eden. So just to create a chronology, Gan Eden exists currently. Any person who passes away in this time, their soul goes to Gan Eden and they are exposed to a magnificent divine revelation, which is very enriching and uplifting for their soul. Mashiach is to come. The time of Mashiach is to come. We're living in the Messianic age, has to unfold in a way that is clear for all of us to see. So that is the next step of development. And so you can expect a greater degree of divine revelation. After the initial Messianic period, then you get Olam Haba, which is the world to come, which is marked by the resurrection of the dead. And that's an even greater divine revelation. So right now, today, we're going to compare the time of Mashiach to Gan Eden in order to understand the difference between the two levels of Tchias HaMeisim, otherwise known as Olam Haba, which we're still to learn about. So that is at Ois Hey, paragraph Hey, which is in front of you now. In order to appreciate the greatness of the time of the resurrection, how much greater that will be than the time of Mashiach. Parenthetically, and of course, once we're talking about that period of the world to come in the resurrection, we are going to split between two different experiences and stages of that period. So to understand that, Yuvan, that will become clear. In order to understand that, we first have to look at the greatness of the Messianic period over what is currently available in Gan Eden. This is how we do things when we learn in-depth Chassidus. We say, here's the point we want to understand. If you imagine that I'm going to just get to that point, that's not going to work. I've got to build this thing. We're dealing with spiritual concepts. We're dealing with abstract concepts. We're dealing with things that are not necessarily part of our reality as we live it. So we need to build these things using a tiered approach. First, we'll explain one concept. Then we'll build on that concept to explain the next concept. So our goal is to understand the period known as Tchias HaMeisim, or Olam Haba, the world to come. Our current phase of getting to understand it will be the comparison between Gan Eden and the time of Mashiach. What's the biggest difference between Gan Eden and Mashiach? Yes, I know people are banging the door down. They want to get into Gan Eden. People are quite concerned during this lifetime. How many things do I need to do in order to be able to merit to get into Gan Eden? It's a big deal. It's like a headline item. It's a big sales pitch in the Jewish world, Gan Eden. And then, of course, you hang out with the Meshuggah Chabadniks and you start getting told, no, Gan Eden, that's just like a temporary housing place for neshamas who are in limbo, in transit, waiting for Mashiach to come. The big thing is Mashiach. So let's understand the difference between Gan Eden, which is currently available, and Mashiach, which we really, really are pushing for. The first difference is obvious. Shehagiloi de Gan Eden hu dafke l'neshamois beloi gufim. There's your first major difference. Gan Eden is only for disembodied souls. Humans don't live in Gan Eden. The only way into Gan Eden is to release the human form, to get rid of the physical state, and then you can get into Gan Eden. Mashiach, as I'm sure you're familiar, happens in the arena of physical planet Earth. That's a big difference. Gan Eden is neshamas without bodies. Mashiach is neshamas in bodies. Oh, and not only that, he tells us more, Kamoi, in brackets, he tells us, Kamoi, Asida Eretz Yisrael Shatoitzi Gilus Ka'ois. Not only will the Mashiach experience be here on earth in the physical form, but our sages, like, for example, this Gemara in Shabbos, go out of their way to tell us that it will be a luxurious physical experience. Gluskois, it says that the land is literally going to produce delicacies. So think of whatever your favorite patisserie is. And you're not going to have to go there anymore and pay these ridiculous kosher prices, because good food is going to literally, you know, when your mother told you that money doesn't grow, it's probably your father, your money doesn't grow on trees. Okay, but when Mashiach comes, good delicacies will literally grow out of the ground. And it says, not only that, but clothing, beautiful clothing. So whatever your favorite brand is, your fashion brand is, that's going to be available when Mashiach comes, literally like nothing. As the Rambam calls it, Ma'adonim Mitzuin Ke'ofar, that all of the great luxuries of life will be as ubiquitous as dust itself. Very different to Gan Eden. Gan Eden is decidedly not a physical experience. As the Rambam tells us, in that world, there's no eating, there's no drinking, and none of the physical activities that you and I are used to. So there's a major difference. Gan Eden, spiritual orientation, Mashiach, physical orientation. Gan Eden, souls only, Mashiach, bodies also. Gan Eden, you divest from physical experience and pleasure. Mashiach offers you physical experience and pleasure. Why? Why? Isn't it logical to say that the greater a spiritual experience is, the less it has to do with physical things? Is that not logical? So if you're going to tell me that Gan Eden is currently available, and then one day we'll graduate to the time of Mashiach, it should come as a huge surprise to suggest that in the time of Mashiach, there will be physical wonder, pleasure. We need to understand that. So there's this very powerful spiritual reason for this. Because we've already identified that Gan Eden is where Hashem reveals what we call the Memale channel, the energy of Hashem that is calibrated and personalized to suit each individual at his or her level, and each reality at its level. And therefore it is what we call Oir Mugbal, a limited energy from Hashem. And because it's Oir Mugbal, therefore it is too limited to be able to share in a lower, more limited world. Now, isn't that ironic? Because you'd expect that if something is limited, it should be accessible to those of us who are limited. Here we're saying the paradoxical statement. Because this energy of Hashem is limited, that's why we who are limited can't access it. Why? It doesn't make any sense. But let's think about this for a second. One of the most famous metaphors that is used in Chassidus to express this concept is the fact that the Torah tells us that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, who was the wisest of all men, he was able to give 3,000 parables for any given concept. Now, what's the big deal about that? I mean, it's impressive. It is impressive, and he probably would have gotten into the Guinness. But what's the chap? So you give another parable, you give another parable. Every one of us knows a rabbi like that. They don't know when to stop talking. And another example, and another example, and another parable. What was great about Shlomo HaMelech was that he was not mugbal. He wasn't limited. See, when we use the word limit, very often we think that limit means I can't be great. So let's say, for argument's sake, you've got a group of people in a room and they're all there to study something. Let's say that it's a first-year engineering course at the university. So there's all these budding engineering students, they're all sitting there. Each one of them is mugbal. Each one of them has limits, but their limits are not the same. So there's a group of A students in that class and there's a group of C students in that class. So the limit of the C student is that he's not an A student. The limit of the A student is that, yes, of course, compared to the C student, I'm amazing, but I'm just a student in first year. Compared to the professor, I'm very limited. I don't know anything. I mean, a few little bits and pieces here that I've learned along the way, but I know nothing compared to the lecturer. So the C student has his limits, and the A student has his limits, and guess what? the professor also has his limits. He is also mugbal. And one of the limits that the professor might very well have is that he could definitely resonate with and educate the A student. He can even educate the C student. But you know what his limit is? His limit is he doesn't know how to make the C student into an A student. And the guy who flunks, the person who fails the year, the lecturer can't even teach him. That's his limit. If you're living in a realm of mugbal, where things are limited, most commonly the limit is you don't know how to relate to something that's outside of your reality. Just as much as the C student cannot extend himself into the world of the A student. The A student's like partying every night and just cramming before an exam and acing everything. The C student cannot relate to that. The C student is working and sweating and focused, but just doesn't have the intellectual capacity to hit an A on occasion. Once in a while, they get an A, it's a huge celebration. That's their limit. They can't step outside of their reality. In exactly the same way, the A student is limited, can't appreciate what it is to be a C student, can't appreciate what it is to have to work that hard. And the lecturer is so limited by being such an academic that he might not know how to speak to anybody who's less than a C student because he just can't get into their world. It's so far from his own world. It's so foreign. Shlomo HaMelech's amazing greatness was that he could speak to every single audience effectively. 3,000 parables. That means the A student needs to be taught the information this way. I'll teach it to him that way, and he'll get it. And the C student needs the same information told to him in this way. I'll share it to him in that way, and he'll get it. And the student who hasn't even made it into the class because he's so limited, I can explain the concept to him and he'll get it. Obviously, they're not going to get to the same extent as the other, but he'll get it. So when we talk about a revelation of Hashem that is mugbal, that is a limited revelation, that limited revelation says, I can only work in a world where things are the world of revelation. This is a revelation of godliness. It's radiance of divine energy. Where can it go? What is its limit? It can go to any place that is open to divine radiance. But a place that's closed to divine radiance, how can I get there? So what's closed to divine radiance? The physical world. Because we walk around our lives and we don't see divine radiance. We see traffic, we see problems, we see people, we see opportunities. We don't see divine radiance. On the odd occasion, something will happen in our lives. Oh, actually, there's a God. And then we'll go right back to who we were. So the light, the energy of Hashem that is mugbal, memale kol olmin, is unable to pierce into our world that is outside of its parameters and illuminate our world. So where do you go if you want access to that light? You've got to go up into that reality. You've got to shed the physical, become a spiritual being, enter Gan Eden, and then you can have that light. If you want to get the brilliance of that lecturer, you've got to leave school, enter the university, throw yourself into the course, really apply yourself, and then you can get what it is that he has to offer. So in Gan Eden, what Hashem shares is a finite degree of his radiance. Of course, for us, it would be mind-blowing, but for him, it's finite and limited. And that's radically different to how things will be in the time of Mashiach, because then in the time of Mashiach, what will be revealed is Hashem's infinite light that has no restriction at all, no limits, no rules, no boundaries, no barriers. And And therefore, that divine revelation doesn't have to wait until we are ready. It can express itself anywhere, even down here in this world. Again, you can see the resonance immediately between the comparison we made between Torah and mitzvahs. Torah, you can't learn Torah unless you learn it. Torah is not just going to jump into your head. It's got its limits. Limits are not bad. It's got its rules. The rules of Torah say, if you learn, if you apply yourself, if you invest, if you work hard, you delve into it day and night, if you toil at it, you will succeed. Those are the rules of Torah, because Torah has that particular limitation associated with it. You need to invest in order to appreciate and experience. That's a limited degree of divine revelation that depends on your preparation. Mitzvahs have no limits. There's no limit. There's no prerequisite to do a mitzvah. A person can walk through your door today and say, listen, I just wanted to know more about Judaism because I heard that my grandmother was Jewish. And you say, really, which grandmother? And they say, my mother's mother. You say, well, what do you know about Judaism? Nothing. Never done a thing in my life before. You say, well, in that case, I would like to share the opportunity with you to do a mitzvah, and you get them to put on tefillin right there and then. How much godliness do they experience? Exactly the same amount as a person who's been from their whole life, as the chief rabbi of Israel, as the greatest tzaddik in history. Because mitzvah is an energy that's not limited. It doesn't require prerequisite. So Gan Eden, which is the reward for Torah, requires that we take the right steps to become spiritual enough to experience it. Mashiach, which is the reward for mitzvahs, requires nothing on our behalf, and we can even be in the physical form and it still can impact and affect us. That's the first major distinction. There's another major distinction. Va'oid chiluk. There's another big difference between the experience of Gan Eden and the experience of Mashiach. What's the other difference? The Gan Eden yesh bichlolus shtei bechinos. Generally speaking, Gan Eden is a graded reality. We're going to talk about the fact that there are two major spheres, and then within those spheres, it's a graded reality. What are the two major spheres? So we talk about Gan Eden HaTachton, the Gan Eden HaElyon. We talk about a lower Gan Eden and a higher Gan Eden. Okay, what exactly the distinction is between the two is something that is discussed in great length in Chassidus. But suffice it to say this: Gan Eden HaTachton, the lower experience of Gan Eden, is where good people go. Gan Eden HaElyon is where tzaddikim go, super individuals, people who are in a completely different spiritual plane. Gan Eden HaTachton is an incredibly overwhelming, exciting experience of Hashem. Wow! But doesn't necessarily have a deep intellectual appreciation for what you're experiencing. Gan Eden HaElyon is all the wow plus the depth of appreciating exactly what you're going through. So generally speaking, Gan Eden is split into two spheres, the upper Gan Eden and the lower Gan Eden. Now we're going to learn in this paragraph that the graduation process from the one Gan Eden to the other, and by extension, the graduation process within each of those Gan Edens is not so simple, as we're about to discover. So there are two major spheres, the higher and lower Gan Eden, and then over Chol Echad Mehem, yesh riboy madregos ad ein kates. In each of the two Gan Eden spheres, there are levels above levels above levels, literally without end. That's why you'll often hear people say when it's a person's yortzat, we wish the person, may the neshama have an aliyah. May the neshama be elevated. Where effectively the principle is that neshamas are on this journey of spiritual development, which basically means more revelation of Hashem and more revelation of Hashem. Typically, it happens on an annual basis on a yortzat. The neshama gets upgraded from whatever level of Gan Eden it is to a higher level of Gan Eden. And if you think that means you've got to pack up your room so you can move to a new suite, that's not what it means. It means that whatever degree of divine insight the neshama had, it now has a far greater degree of divine insight. And that can continue literally indefinitely. That's why, Kamai Merazal, our sages say that Talmidei Chachamim ein lohem menucha chulo yelchem echayel el choyel. Right, the end of the Gemara Brachos says that Torah scholars, they never rest. You know, the world, generally speaking, whatever the world says is usually contrary to Torah. Like, that's what they say. Das balabatim heipech Torah. Like, the conventional wisdom is usually the exact opposite of the Torah's wisdom. What does conventional wisdom say? No rest for the wicked. And the Torah says the exact opposite. It says, Talmidei Chachamim ein lahem menucha. The righteous are the ones who have no rest. Why? Because rest is a bad thing. Yeah, of course, there's a concept of Shabbos, but the idea of retirement, the idea of the eternal resting place, that's not good. The whole gift of life is that you can grow and develop and upgrade and mature. So therefore the Gemara says, Talmidei Chachamim, the great people, ein lohem menucha, they never rest, because there are these infinite levels of growth that are available in Gan Eden. Yes, it's not the physical world, and so therefore you can't self-propel. In other words, in this world, you do a mitzvah, you can jump a few steps in terms of spiritual development. In that world, you can only go one step at a time and on a graded system, and you pretty much are running off the investment that you made during this life. But the fact is, it's growth. And that's why the Tehillim tells us, Yelchu mechayel el choyel, they go from strength to strength. She'oilim tomid mi madrega le madrega. They consistently lift themselves and grow from one level to the next level to the next level. And what he's going to say next is fascinating. What does it mean they have no rest? What's the big deal? You get upgraded. There are all these different levels. And let's just say that a person gets upgraded. No. Why does that mean that there's no rest? You tell me. Ever hear of somebody who gets on a plane and they say, sir, we're upgrading you? So, I have no rest. Are you joking? An upgrade is usually very positive and seamless and comfortable and welcomed. So why, if we're talking about neshamas being upgraded on a consistent basis, why do we use the expression that they have no rest? So listen to what he says. It's fascinating. That means that in order for a soul to progress from one level within Gan Eden to the next level within Gan Eden, that requires work. But you're going to say there's no work in that world. This is the work, as we read in last week's parasha. This is the world where you can do things. This is the world where you can change. This is the world where you can achieve. There's no achievement. It's a conveyor belt. You're on the belt and off you go. What do you mean, avoida? So he says, avoida doesn't necessarily mean self-driven work. It means that in Shamayim, in Gan Eden, where they want to move a neshama along from level A to level A+, they make that neshama go through an experience that is a lot of work to go through. So here in this world, the work that we do is self-propelled. We choose. I'm going to push myself to learn. I'm going to daven with more focus. I'm going to do another mitzvah, give more tzedakah than what I've given in the past, etc., etc. These are our choices. And some of those things that we choose to do are a lot of work. Gan Eden, the work that happens is imposed. They say, all right, it's time for this neshama to move along. In order to move along, you have to go through these processes. And here are the processes in brief. So he says, what does it mean? The Baaliyah. First bit of work is that there's a mikvah that every neshama has to go through each time it wants to upgrade from one level of Gan Eden to the next. The difference between this mikvah and the one that you might know here in your neighborhood is that this mikvah is called a river of fire. Now, here's a fascinating thing. You know, outside of the Jewish world, when people talk about the next world and fire, you know what they're referring to, right? And it's not a happy place, right? Not a happy place. When they talk about this river of fire. here in mysticism, Jewish mysticism, this river of fire is an incredibly positive experience, even though it's not an easy experience. What is it? To forget level A so that you can access level A+. That's why he says, Lishkoach hasaga, to forget the degree of understanding, ve'hatainug, and the pleasure that was associated with that understanding in order to go from one place to the next. So there's a preparation. Before the neshama can upgrade, it has to prepare by being immersed in this river of fire. And we'll talk about that in a second. Number 2, plus, the way that a neshama actually moves from one level to the other is through a particular column, as the mystics describe it. It goes up a column that separates between one level and the next. Of course, none of this is physical, so you shouldn't be thinking about, hey, so it's sitting over here on, let's call it the 2nd floor, and now it gets into an elevator that takes it up to the 3rd floor, and that's like this column. It's clearly not a spiritual, not a physical experience. And that also helps to shed the previous perspective. I'm going to read to the end of the sentence and then we can talk about what this means. It's just that the immersion in this river of fire, that is a sense of submission that comes from below. Whereas the submission that is caused by the so-called pillar is because of what comes from above. Okay, let's understand what's going on over here. The Gemara tells a story that there was a great sage, his name was Rabbi Zera. And Rabbi Zera came from Babylon, and he was very, very well versed, one of the leading scholars in the Babylonian Talmud. And then he came to Israel. In Israel, around about the same time that the Babylonian Talmud developed in Babylon, there was a small Jewish community still living in Israel, and they developed a Talmud of their own, which became known as the Jerusalem Talmud. So Rabbi Zera comes from Babylon, and now he wants to learn the Torah with the approach of the scholars of Israel at the time, which was a radically different approach to the Babylonian approach. So guess what he did? You'd never believe this. You'd never expect it. Doesn't seem to make any sense. He fasted. And he fasted a series of fasts with the intention that he could forget his learning from Babylon. Now, I don't know about you. I don't have to fast to do that. I'm pretty good at forgetting the things that I've learned, right? What do you mean, I fast? I mean, you hang on to every bit of information that you've learned because forgetfulness seems to be the problem. And not something that you would invite, not something that you would want, not something that you would look for. Why on earth would he do that? Okay, you're going to tell me because he wanted to learn a new style of learning, because it's a hate. So learn how you learned before. Now come across a new style, blend the two together. Fantastic. You know what Rabbi Zera knew and understood, which is a profound insight of Judaism? He knew and he understood that real growth only happens when you can escape the limits of how you were before. If you think of a child compared to an adult, nothing wrong with a child. On the contrary, children are beautiful. They are so sincere. They have this naivete about them, the innocence. Beautiful. They're also immature. You would not want a child running your country. And I know you probably think that you have a child running your country. And that could be any country in the world, right? People, we have issues with our leadership. It's not for this conversation. You wouldn't want a child treating you in a surgery. You need somebody to have maturity, knowledge, life experience. So in order to become an adult, one of the things that has to happen is you have to forget what it is to be a child. As tragic as that is, and people are really upset about it, and you know, we had this beautiful life when we were children, and now we've become cynical and jaded and all that kind of thing. But in order to become an adult, you have to forget what it is to be a child. And in order to do that, you go through a period in life called adolescence. Turmoil, absolute turmoil. You don't know who you are anymore. You don't know what you value anymore. You don't know who you respect anymore. One day you feel this way, the next day you feel that way. Your body changes, your mind changes, your emotions change, your priorities change, everything changes, and it is so tumultuous to go through. Anybody who lives under the same roof as a teenager will know that they are a unique breed of human. 1 minute, they could be the most insightful, caring, mature person on the planet. The next minute, having a tantrum like a 2-year-old. That's the river of fire. That's the river of fire, where you completely reconstitute who you were, because who you were before was beautiful for then. But try and plug that into who you are about to become, and it will fall so flat on its face, it'll be the worst thing that ever happened to you. Try and import a 6-year-old into air traffic control at JFK Airport. You cannot do that. You cannot be that person. You've got to grow. You've got to not just grow, you've got to shed who you were before. That's the river of fire. Second of all, then you open the door to this new reality, and it's like, wow, overwhelming. First time a person has to take responsibility for a family. The first time the person has to actually do a surgery. The first time a person actually flies solo. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. It's humbling. Any person who swaggers in over there and thinks, I'm a big deal and I got this, that's where the problems happen. So there's this amud. This amud is like this insight, this peering into a new reality and suddenly realizing how powerful and how overwhelming that new reality is. It makes you feel small. So every time an neshama moves through Gan Eden, it goes through this dual process. The turmoil of letting go of who I was so I can prepare myself for what's coming. And then this awesome awareness of how powerful and amazing that new reality is, that you feel like the kid who's learning to drive for the first time. You've got to remember all the things. What do you turn? Where do you push? Which mirror do you look at? And then eventually that becomes normal again. That becomes your reality. That becomes comfortable. But the transition to get there was stormy. So what do we see about Gan Eden? Gan Eden is graded. Gan Eden has many, 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 many levels, to the point that it is Ein Kates without limit. And the transition from level to level is very dramatic. Why? Because what operates in Gan Eden is personalized revelation. You want a greater revelation, you need to become a new person. Let's continue inside. That's why we describe that the progress from one level to the next in Gan Eden requires work. Again, not self-motivated work, work that we are thrown into. Like, for example, when a person has to take responsibility, you get a promotion at work and now you have more people under you. There is work to be done. It's not necessarily work that you chose to do, but there is work. You're working through stuff. Who am I? Where do I relate? How do I now, the people who were my peers and now my subordinates, how do I relate to them? So a lot of work, a lot of reconstitution of who I am. That's how Gan Eden operates. Primarily, avodas habitul. The primary work that a soul does in Gan Eden on its journey is the work of bittul, the ability to relinquish the old self. That is the primary work that a neshama does in Gan Eden. So everybody thinks you go to Gan Eden and it's fantastic and you sit there and you love it and they're playing harps and they're serving, I don't know what to eat and drink, and it's tranquil and it's tropical. That's not Gan Eden at all. Gan Eden is an extreme makeover of who your neshama is on a regular basis, minimally on an annual basis, ideally more frequently than that. Total remake of who I am, what I believe, what I understand, what depth I have. Dismantle the old self, upgraded version. And each time it's through a process called bittul, the ability to let go of self. Which incidentally is bedugmas ha'avodah lamata bo'olam hazeh. In a certain sense, that experience of the soul in Gan Eden is reflective of the primary things that we're supposed to do to serve Hashem in this world. What are we supposed to do? There's an expression that our sages use, that the Torah was given in this world, letzaref es habrios, which basically means to refine people. Avoida milashon ibud oiros. And the word avoida is related to the principle called ibud oiros, which means working hard. In other words, look, we're modern people, okay? We live in urbanized 21st century. We don't really know up front, up close, what it means to work hard. We go to the mall, we see the item, what's it made of? Gesundheit, we take it home. Nobody sits working a piece of leather to become a handbag. We don't know what it is. But the concept of ibud oiros means that it's a tremendous amount of exertion, a tremendous amount of investment, a tremendous amount of effort to take something from a raw, original material to become a refined, developed final product. The goal of Torah is to take each of us and the world that we live in out of the raw state into a sublime state. The more raw something is, the more it exists for itself. Think about it. A piece of leather really doesn't serve any purpose. The more sublime something becomes, the more it serves a higher goal. That piece of leather is now a handbag. Serves a higher goal. In spiritual terms, the more raw a person is, the more it's about me. I need to eat. I need money. I need fame. I need things. As the person works on themselves, letzaref es habrios, to refine, so the person becomes more conscious of, I'm here to serve. There's a higher purpose. There's a connection to Hashem that is more important than anything else. And that's what we work through, constantly shedding. The goal of life, as we know it, is to shed the self that is interested only in me, and to develop the sense of, how do I give? And especially, how do I connect to Hashem? That's reflected in what the neshama will go through in Gan Eden. It will consistently let go of the sense of I and connect to a higher purpose. Now, somebody's asked the question privately over here, so what about reincarnation and how does that fit into this? It's very interesting that although reincarnation is a fascinating subject and it's dealt with in depth in works of Kabbalah, Chassidus doesn't give it a tremendous amount of airtime. And the reason is basically because the Baal Shem Tov is known to have said that everything we need to know about how to serve Hashem in this life, we know. What happened to us in previous lives, although it may influence who we are, why we face certain things, etc., in service of Hashem, is actually not relevant for us to know in this life. So reincarnation is a fascinating subject for us to discuss, but Chassidus doesn't spend a lot of time on it. So reincarnation is a different process to what we're describing over here. Here we're describing once a neshama is in a healthy state and the neshama is growing. Reincarnation tackles a neshama that may not yet be in a healthy state and has to come into this world again and again in order to achieve certain things or complete certain things or to be able to grow and develop so that it can access something like Gan Eden. Okay? Would reincarnation impede somebody having the share in the world to come? No, because we said clearly everybody has a share in the world to come. So reincarnation would assist the neshama to reach the point where it can benefit out of the Gan Eden experience. Okay, so what have we got so far? What we've said is that the primary differences between Gan Eden and Mashiach is that Gan Eden has to be a neshama without a body, and Mashiach is a time in the body. The second distinction, we haven't seen both sides of it yet, is that Gan Eden is a place of constant development, and the way that you develop is you have to shed the old skin in order to become a new you. Still on the subject of Gan Eden and the process of how neshamas upgrade from one level to the other, we have said that generally speaking, the idea of the neshama having to achieve a state of bittul, a state of submission, a state of letting go of self is quite similar to what we're doing in our mitzvahs here in this world, which is to refine ourselves and to elevate ourselves and open our minds, etc. So sticking with that theme, we're just going to bring one more nuance to it, and that is that our service of Hashem in this world, in the here and now, follows two primary areas of service. Sur Meirat, not to do what's wrong. Asay toiv, to do what is expected of us. So in a similar vein, there are two major channels that the soul has to go through in order to upgrade from one level to the next in Gan Eden. The immersion of the soul in this so-called river of fire to shed the old self, that aligns with the service of Hashem, not to do wrong. So you get rid of the bad. In this world, it's to get rid of bad behavior. In that world, it's to get rid of the part of the neshama that might be an interference to my new opportunity for growth. And then you have Abitul Shal Yadei Ha'amud, Shemitzad Giloi Oir Ha'elian Dugmas Ha'avoida Devasei Tov. And the second phase of the development of the soul in Gan Eden is that we said it is then exposed to this incredible light of godliness represented by this so-called column. And that light and energy of godliness is so powerful and dynamic that it makes the person shrink back in the sense of bittul submission. Okay, whatever you say, that's similar in human experience to doing good, doing what Hashem wants, being attracted to the light. But now back to the point we want to discuss, the Kol Zeu B'Gan Eden. This entire process that we have described, no menucha, no rest, let you go from strength to strength, the development of the neshama, all of that stuff. That's all Gan Eden. Now listen to this, because this is interesting. What's going to happen when Moshiach comes? What do you think? When Mashiach comes, there's not going to be constant upgrade. What do you think? Mashiach will be less of an experience than Gan Eden? No, definitely not. In the time of Mashiach, there will be multiple ongoing upgrades. We'll keep growing. That's what people always ask. What's going to happen when Mashiach comes? Will there be any challenge? Will we have choice? 100%. It'll just be different to what we know. But we're not just going to vegetate when Mashiach comes. We're not going to say, okay, shkayach, thank you, everybody. The Jews have done well for 3,300 years. Now you get to sit back and enjoy life. No. There is no value in rest. There is only value in recharge. Shabbos is recharge. And the greatest value is in growth and development. So when Mashiach comes, there for sure will be growth. Definitely growth. And okay, now but what's the difference? So Aliyah Oz, the Aliyah, the elevation of soul, the elevation of life, the elevation of individual that will happen when Mashiach comes will be in a different method, a different technology. The technology of Gan Eden is dismantle the old, construct the new. The technology of Gan Eden is shed level A and then be overwhelmed by level A plus until eventually it becomes your reality. And then shed level A plus and be overwhelmed by level A plus plus until eventually that becomes your reality. What's going to happen with Mashiach is, even though there'll be many, also you could say untold numbers of spiritual developments and upgrades, there won't be that element of that work, that turmoil, that stripping away the old self in order to get to the new self. That's not going to be. When Mashiach comes, there will not be the requirement of having to lose who I was before in order to be able to gain who I could be. That turmoil, that drama, that's for Gan Eden. In the time of Mashiach, only the benefit of growth, only the development without the turmoil. And then he says something very interesting, and he puts in brackets, which means that this is a bit of an unfinished topic and it needs a lot more research. And it's a fascinating point. In the time of Mashiach, it will be possible for a person to be who you are, and as you are, upgrade to the next level. Remember, Gan Eden, we said, is defined by a level of divine revelation that is personalized and therefore has its limits. So the limits include that if you want level A, you have to become a level A person. And if you're currently a level B person, you've got to get rid of the level B person so that you can upgrade to a level A person. That's how it is in Gan Eden. When Mashiach comes and Hashem reveals an even deeper, more profound degree of godliness, a degree of godliness that is not mugbal, that has no limits, then he says, who you are now, I can take into a higher level. You understand that? It's an incredible thought. You don't have to shift. You don't have to change. You don't have to lose. You don't have to divest. Who you are in your now can be drawn in to the incredible experience of what Hashem has to reveal in the time of Mashiach. This is a revolutionary insight. Everybody believes that in order to gain any kind of spiritual experience, you have to grow. The revolution in this mimer is that Mashiach's revelation, and it's not Mashiach himself, but the revelation of God that will happen in the Mashiach period is so powerful and so incredible that it can even touch you without you having to change to get there. It's like King Solomon, who can even speak to the person who could never pass the subject, who could speak to the child and bring the experience of the wisdom to them. Mashiach's time will bring the experience of godliness in its unmitigated form to us as we are. And we'll talk more about that, please God, next week. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments, but you're certainly welcome to ask.
Thank you.
No problem. It's a pleasure.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. Phew.
Lots to think about.
Lots to think about.